with Greenland and to a lesser extent Venezuela is that we'll be starting to think about how to become more self-reliant in defense. Part of that includes space. And I think that we need to start thinking about how we can do more here in Australia on space. And I think what you're going to see in the next 12 months is a greater focus on building space capabilities.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Now, since President Donald Trump ordered that mission to capture Venezuela's president, that was January 3rd, and the latest rancors push to annex Greenland, which remains a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, a NATO nation and a longtime U.S. ally, a lot of the focus has been on South America and Europe, and rightly so. But the United States has allies in the Western Pacific, north and south of the equator, and some have developed or are developing sovereign space capabilities for civilian or commercial use, as well as for defense. But from that acrimony, especially with the NATO allies over Greenland, I began to wonder just what is the view from down under? Australia and the United States have enjoyed very close ties in trade and security since the signing of the 1951 ANZUS Treaty. In the 7+ decades since, this relationship has only deepened with more treaties and agreements. They cover subjects like the status of U.S. forces on Australian soil, technology integration, nuclear submarines, intelligence sharing, and there's more regarding the space domain. In 2018, Australia and the United States signed the Deep Space Network Agreement. 2 years later, Australia joined the Artemis Accords. In 2024, the Technology Safeguards Agreement, also known as the TSA, was signed to allow American space launch companies to provide launch services from Australia. And just this last October, the two nations signed the Civil Space Framework Agreement to essentially cut red tape and accelerate space technology development and deployment. Nevertheless, Australia and its neighbors are seeing the rules governing the old world order dissolve. So what does Australia need to do to navigate this time of change, especially in the space domain? To discuss, we have Malcolm Davis in Canberra. Here's our conversation. Hey, Malcolm. Welcome back to the Downlink podcast. It has been ages.
It's been a long time, but it's great to be here.
Well, you are not someone who is easily forgotten, and perhaps some of you in the audience will remember seeing Malcolm appear on CNN, Sky News, or ABC Australia. In fact, that's actually how I found you way back when. It was a special on China. But let's help out our new listeners here in the United States and abroad. So please take a moment and introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Dr. Malcolm Davis. I'm a Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is located in Canberra.
And he is known all over the world, and I am so honored to have you back. So, as you know, the United States really kicked off this new year with a whirlwind of a January, right? So January 3rd, President Trump ordered U.S. military forces to conduct a large-scale strike across Venezuela's capital city, Caracas. And the goals of that mission were to capture the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife. Their son was also a target, but wasn't at home when the U.S. Army elite Delta Force showed up in his bedroom. And the other ostensible goal was to control Venezuela's suzerainty, including its oil exports. Internationally, that piercing of sovereignty certainly had political advisors around the world looking up the Monroe Doctrine, right? But if anyone thought that President Trump's attention was focused solely on the Americas, think again. We're now in a diplomatic ceasefire of a sort over the sovereignty of Greenland, which isn't green and it's not Iceland. It's a semi-autonomous territory governed by Denmark, a longtime U.S. ally, and a founding NATO nation. And it's also not interested in handing over Greenland or selling it to the United States. But President Trump wants Greenland. His argument there is that Greenland is essential for U.S. national defense and the Golden Dome Missile Defense Shield project. Now, I said we're in a ceasefire of sorts. After the fiery rhetoric punctuated last week's World Economic Forum, the NATO Secretary General is brokering some sort of arrangement over Greenland, and diplomats met yesterday here in ice-covered Washington, D.C. And in all of this, I gotta wonder, how are nations in your neighborhood reacting or digesting these developments? And I gotta wonder, what could be the effects in the space domain for cooperation and trust? So, yeah, what's the view from down under?
Well, look, I think both Venezuela and more significantly Greenland did generate shockwaves across the policy and the diplomatic community here in Australia. I think it really drove home the point that the rules-based international order is over. It's gone. And so therefore we have to start adapting to a new international order where essentially you're starting to see spheres of influence emerge, with the US focusing on the Western Hemisphere, China obviously wanting to dominate East Asia,
That's
and
not
Russia
new.
wanting to dominate Europe. And the concern is that I think President Trump might be willing to play along with this and build in these spheres of influence so long as he gains what he wants. And obviously from an allied perspective, we have to be concerned about our interests in that situation. I don't think Greenland is over by any means. I think that it's only on a pause. I think Trump will probably come back and say, no, we want it. The details out of Davos were extremely vague in terms of what the arrangement was, in terms of these so-called pockets of sovereignty around US bases. That's as far as we got, and we didn't know any more from that. So with that introduction in place, I think that in terms of where Australia is going in its relations with the US, I think we value our relation with the US. We are concerned about some of the developments, but we have to work with the US because our defense and security arrangements are incredibly integrated and reliant on US working with us. And if we walk away from the US, which we're not going to do, things fall apart and the center cannot hold, as they say in that famous poem by Yeats. And so we essentially, we don't have the ability then to effectively defend ourselves. Now, I think that what you have seen with Greenland and to a lesser extent Venezuela is that we'll be starting to think about how to become more self-reliant in defense. Part of that includes space. And I think that we need to start thinking about how we can do more here in Australia on space. And I think what you're going to see in the next 12 months is a greater focus on building space capabilities that firstly allow us to work with the Americans and burden share in orbit, but also give us that degree of self-reliance and independence where we need it. And so things like satellite communications are really important. In late 2024, the Australian government cancelled the key project for satellite communications, which was known as JP9102. There was immediate outcry in the space community. And so the government, within a day or so, backtracked and said, oh, we're not cancelling it, we're just redefining it. And they're going from what was originally meant to be 4 or 5 satellites in GEO down to a distributed proliferated LEO constellation. So we need to see some guidance on that. And I think here's a golden opportunity for Australia to have a self-reliant space capability in SATCOM if we play our cards right, but the money has to be there. The other area where I think we are going to see progress in space is launch. You are seeing companies like Gilmore Space Technology moving ahead. It's got its next attempt to launch this year. I think once they are successful, then you are going to see options open up for Australia to do its own launch capability. So there's 2 areas where I think are really critical for Australia in space.
Oh, I love how you're just jumping right into my next question without completely answering my first question. So I'm going to refocus just real quick, because the other thing I'm really also interested in is the view from your neighbors, right? Because the neighbors are also part of the patchwork of alliances. We've got Japan, we've got Taiwan, we've got South Korea, we've got the Philippines, we've got Indonesia, probably. I don't think that they're too interested, and they've had some issues with the Chinese as well over islands. So, yeah, what is the neighborhood feeling right now?
Look, I think in terms of space, there are opportunities for collaboration with those states, particularly between Australia and Japan, Australia and South Korea, India as well as a potential partner, and the Quad had a space element to its activities. Although the Quad seems now to have taken rather a backseat since India became an observer member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But I think that certainly Australian, Japanese, Australian, South Korean cooperation on space is very important. Real opportunities there for Japanese and South Korean companies to work with us on satellites, on space domain awareness, on launch capabilities, so that, given Australia's advantageous geography close to the equator, we become a space hub for launch for the region, not just for Australia. So South Korean rockets, Japanese rockets can launch from Australia, exploiting our natural geography, gaining advantage in that sense.
That would be pretty cool because, I mean, the South Koreans do have a rocket that works now.
Yeah,
It's the Nuri.
exactly.
I mean, they've launched it 4 times, and the last time I think was in November, and it was a success.
And
Now,
there's
if they
South
could
Korean
do
companies.
that,
Yeah,
in Australia at your latitude, they could put more stuff on the rocket.
exactly. And there's a company called InnoSpace in South Korea that is engaged in discussions with an Australian company called Equatorial Launch Australia, which originally had intended to launch from a location in the Northern Territory called Nhulunbuy, but has now moved its launch site to Cape York in northern Queensland. And InnoSpace are very interested in launching rockets from Cape York. So I think that's a positive. That certainly, as I said, the Japanese are very interested in doing something similar. We've also got the launch site that potentially could emerge in the south at Whalers Way, which is ideal for sun synchronous and polar orbit missions. And so you've had, for example, Taiwanese AT Space, I think it is, Taiwanese companies, sort of trying to work with Southern Launch to be able to launch from that location. I think that some of the other countries in the region are probably less advanced. So the Philippines and Indonesia, I think the Philippines has got a small space industry, but it's mainly focused on small satellite technologies. They're not looking at launch per se. Same with Indonesia. Sorry, they're very well situated because they're right on the equator, with Biak Island literally on the equator. But Biak Island is also politically unstable. And so there's real challenges politically to making progress for Indonesia to do launch as opposed to technologically or commercially. So I think the key players in the region that I see are Japan, South Korea, Australia, obviously New Zealand with Rocket Lab, and potentially India as well.
Something else that also really caught my eye, and this is coming out of Australia, and this is also by way of association as well. But I was really quite excited to read that QuantX Labs, and that's an Australian company that produces quantum atomic clocks. They have a technology that is supposed to help navigation without using global navigation satellite systems. Right. It still comes from space. I'm not really sure how it all works. And for that, I really should have Martin O'Connor, COO, back because he was on the podcast about, I don't know, maybe half a year ago when the Aussies came with all their quantum toys here to the United States. That was fun and really nerd-tastic. But it's supposed to launch this year, according to the Australian Space Agency. Right. It's on their page saying this is what's coming in 2026. I'm really looking forward to that. And it's interesting what you were saying about Gilmore Space. And they had a test recently-ish. And just this month, they raised 175 million US dollars, which I think is actually pretty close to Australian dollars, but I could be wrong.
About 220 million Australian dollars. So
there you go.
It's a huge accomplishment for them because it really gives them a boost as they prepare for their next test launched from Bowen in Queensland. And they're doing more than just space launch. They're actually building satellites as well. So, Gilmore, I think, recognized that they have to do more than just launch. They can't rely on that alone until they can get the launch capabilities perfected and they can get the launch cadence up. And then they can start to focus more on that. But certainly satellites are important. They're also doing research into hypersonics related work. So Gilmore are very active. I think, I see them as the great white hope for Australia's space community. Because when you look at our community, you have to differentiate between the defense side of space and the civil and commercial side of space. Defense, I think, is probably going quite well. They look like they could get more funding in the next National Defense Strategy and Integrated Investment Program, which comes out in April. But the commercial side, I think, is drifting a bit. And so there
All
needs to be
right.
more of it.
Well, I hate to pick at what has been a bit of a sore spot, and now you've just shined a ray of hope onto it. But yeah, I mean, what is the plan for Australia's Department of Defense and Space, right? It came up in a recent offline debate I had with a fellow from a consulting company, and that company will remain nameless. But that company is working with the Australian military to develop its space equities.
Mm.
Right. And yeah, we had this little back and forth, and I kind of know a thing or two because I listened to you, but I haven't seen anything recently that I would say that is really serious.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what's the state of play, man?
Well, everything is on hold until the National Defence Strategy and the Integrated Investment Program. That's the Australian documents, not the US National Defence Strategy, until they're released in April. And then the budget is released in May. So everything is kind of waiting. We're all holding our breath to see exactly what happens. But I think there's three key areas that defence will focus on in space. The first is space support, and that's where SATCOM comes in and JP 9102. They have to actually give some sort of clear guidance as to how they're going to proceed to this distributed architecture across LEO, MEO, and GEO. Second is space domain awareness. That's really important. And Australia will be setting up and beginning operations with the Deep Space Advanced Radar Capability, or DARC, out at Northwest Cape this year. So that contributes to CSPO and so forth, our ability to look out to GEO and monitor activities out at GEO. And the third is space control. And the previous NDS and IIP, which was released in 2024, made it clear that space control is something we have to start thinking about because space is contested. We've got Chinese and Russian counter space capabilities. We need to be able to work with the US and our other allies to ensure that our space capabilities are safe. So I think there'll be a lot of work in space control in terms of what can we do without going down the path of kinetic kill ASATs that create clouds of space debris. So it's got to be soft kill. It's got to be disable and deny rather than physically destroy. And we have to be able to work with the US and with other partners to ensure that we can protect our satellites in a crisis if they come under threat. Those three areas, I think, is where defense is heading. They have a strategy going forward into the 2030s as to how they make progress in those three areas. That includes, sort of a focus on working with commercial space here in Australia to provide certain, sort of capabilities, but also working with the Americans and with others. So it's sovereign where we need it, but foreign when we have the opportunity to do so, and commercial as needed versus sort of mil spec, if you like. I think that defense space effort probably needs greater clarity. There is a new defense space strategy that's being developed to replace the old one, which was released back in 2022. And we've just had a defense space domain concept called Selene, as in the moon, which basically explains how defense sees space and what it does in space. And that's available at the official level of classification. So it's not classified, but it's not really available. But I just happen to have a copy on my table. But
that's just because you're so cool. But hey there, we've had all this talk about Golden Dome in regards to Greenland. And there's also some interesting language in the current National Defense Appropriations Act, which is saying that legislators don't have enough eyesight onto it. And I'm not really sure about how the 23 to 26 billion, depends on how you look at it, is being spent. But nevertheless, let's put those kind of crankinesses to the side. Uh, hey, could Australia get in on the action with Golden Dome? And it was a point that President Trump did raise. It was like, well, we need Greenland for Golden Dome, and we need some more cooperation on Golden Dome. Well, hey, is this something that Australia could get in on, especially with the ground station at Pine Gap? Which I would imagine is important for Golden Dome, but I can't claim to really know. But yeah, does Australia have an appetite for getting more involved, especially on the space side of this effort?
Well, look, I think we should, and we must, because the previous national defense strategy and IIP ignored advice from a key defense review that came out the year before in 2023 that
No.
that we should prioritize integrated air and missile defense. It didn't do it. It didn't.
No.
So
Why?
now, virtually everyone in the strategic policy community here in Australia is saying to government, we need integrated air and missile defense for defending our critical facilities to the north, which are pretty much undefended at the moment. I mean, Chinese can strike them with intermediate range ballistic missiles, and we can do nothing about it. So I think what you will see in the next National Defence Strategy and Integrated Investment Program, as I said, which comes out April this year, is greater funding for IAMD. And that's a golden opportunity, pardon the pun, to get in on Golden Dome. We should be sitting down and talking to the Americans about how we can contribute beyond what Pine Gap offers, which is that missile early warning function and critical sharing of intelligence.
Could you
When I,
explain Pine Gap just a little bit more?
yeah,
Because I
it,
don't
it's
think
a
people
high.
are really knowledgeable of it. And in fact, when you and I spoke prior to recording today, I did actually, I will admit, I got the name wrong. I called it Pine Ridge. Sorry. But yeah, Pine Gap. Could you explain, what it does, who runs it? Like, what do they do there?
It's a joint facility run
And
jointly
where
by.
is it
It's
besides
just
Australia?
near Alice Springs, okay, in the middle of Australia. It's a joint facility run by the US and Australia. And what it does is perform two tasks. Firstly, it's missile early warning. So it receives information from systems like SIBRs and DSP that monitor ballistic missile launches from orbit and then relays that information to the US National Command and Control system for the nuclear forces. So that's a critical function in terms of strengthening deterrence. Second function is in relation to sort of the more shady world of intelligence gathering and so forth. And I won't talk so much about that. But I think where Pine Gap would really play a role, obviously, is in that missile early warning role. But in terms of Golden Dome, firstly, we can have a direct role because when you look at what the Chinese and the Russians are developing, they're starting to invest in fractional orbital bombardment systems, or FOBs, which just happen to fly over Australia as they proceed over the South Pole before heading up to hit targets in the continental US. So there would be value in having Golden Dome-based or related sensors in Australia to monitor those launches so that it gives the US greater early warning against FOBs threats coming over
So
the South Pole.
So this could work like, let's say, in a boost phase, because I was just at a conference yesterday and everyone was talking about sensors and time and making sure that you can do things very, very fast.
Yeah.
Right. So boost phase is a real point of the Golden Dome to actually get these things before they get up into orbit and before they get into, I guess you could say, like a mid-course phase,
Yeah.
aka glide phase, depending upon what the thing is. And where they're harder to find because they're
Sure.
no longer burning, right? They're no longer, have this fire at the bottom of the rocket. So would Pine Gap be able to perform a function like that?
Oh, yes, in the sense that it gets the data from SIBRs down to Pine Gap, which then goes out to the USNC3 system. So Pine Gap plays a key role. But if you wanted to put sensors to counter boost phase, to allow boost phase intercepts, they've got to be up threat. So Australia is too far south in that regard. So you'd have to have sensors closer to the launch sites in China and Russia and North Korea to do that. But where Australia could play a key role, I think, is in providing the proliferated warfighter strategic communications architecture to ensure that the space segment of Golden Dome is effectively managed. And that could be related to Pine Gap as well. It would be an extension of Pine Gap, if you like. As I said, the other thing is you could potentially use sensors and interceptors to counter FOBs. And the third thing is Golden Dome needs to do more than just CONUS defense. It needs to also provide a defense against regional threats from China in particular. The sort of things like intermediate range ballistic missiles, hypersonic weapons, and so forth. So having Australia involved in Golden Dome would directly contribute towards that aspect, which would protect us from missile threats, but also make it easier for the United States and other allies to operate in the region, including from Australian bases. So I think there's a strong case for us to be involved in Golden Dome as it contributes to that essential requirement for integrated air and missile defense. But it also means that we're burden sharing with the Americans. And that's really critical if you look at the US national defense strategy, which really places a great deal of emphasis on burden sharing and allies stepping up and doing more to ensure collective defense and deterrence by denial.
That's real true. I want to switch your focus real quick. And this should be our last question, really, because I know we're running out of time, but this is an important one. China is your neighbor, and we haven't been talking about all the achievements that China has made this year because I really wanted to find out about the allies, because we don't really talk about the allies perhaps as often as we should. And plus, I also know that you watch China. Hey, what's up with the purge of General Zhang Youxia and General Liu Junli from the Central Military Commission? Now, while General Liu has no real space experience, Zhang does. General Zhang Youxia, back in 2013, was the chief commander of the China Manned Space Engineering Office. He oversaw the Shenzhou 10 mission, which was a crewed mission. So now the Central Military Commission, which is supposed to have 7 members, now after the latest purges, because there were others before now, it has only 2 members. And those 2, Xi Jinping and Zhang Shengmin, and General Zhang Shengmin is a political commissar and anti-corruption official, not so much involved in the profession of arms. Right? So it's about anti-corruption, allegedly, but it's all very weird. And there was another fellow who was also on the CMC that also had a pretty huge, strong, actually, space background. What's going on here, right? I mean, and what's the effect on the space domain from China? I mean, they've had they've notched a lot of progress in 2025. Record launches, 92, Chang'e 6 mission, reusable rocket technology. I mean, they've been definitely, evolving, but this is weird.
It is. Look, I think what you are seeing is the centralization and concentration of power to Xi Jinping at the ultimate level. So Xi basically assumes total direct control of everything. As you say, there's one other officer in the CMC now, and he's a political officer. So he's basically a mouthpiece for Xi. So I think that what you will see is Xi trying to directly assert power and control over all other arms of the Chinese military. It may have been that Zhang Youxia and Liu Zhenli, excuse my pronunciation, I'm not good at those.
Don't worry about it.
Could have been challenging Xi in terms of Xi's determination to be ready by 2027 to take Taiwan. They could have been providing advice to Xi that, we're not ready to do it. And so Xi got rid of them. It really does raise the important question, has this purge pushed back the scenario, the likelihood of an attack on Taiwan, or has it brought it forward, made it more likely? I think the policy community is kind of divided. Some are saying it makes Taiwan in 2027 less likely because of the disarray at the highest command levels of the PLA as a result of this purge. But it could also mean that if you don't have anyone in the CMC providing independent advice to Xi, then Xi's more likely to make rash decisions, and with no one to stop him, the PLA will do stuff that really they shouldn't be doing. So I think that it's really hard to say where this leads. In terms of space, it's hard to say. I mean, I think that the PLA Aerospace Force will continue to work on its space capabilities, including counter space capabilities. They'll be watching what the Americans are doing with the US Space Force and what other countries are doing with their own space commands. So I think that will continue. I don't necessarily see disruption to Chinese space activities. What I do think is that this is more about Xi concentrating power in his own hands, being undisputed and unchallenged within the CMC, and thus having total say as to when and if China does move on Taiwan. I think that my reading of the situation at the moment, looking at the US national defense strategy and the language in that, the speech by Bridge Colby in South Korea the other day, I suspect the Chinese will hold off until after April of this year, certainly because Trump is going to Beijing. They will want to see if they can do a deal with Trump whereby the quid pro quo for a better trading relationship between the US and China is that Trump walks away from defending Taiwan. And I think that we'll see what happens with that in terms of leading into 2027. But clearly, Xi is determined to take Taiwan no matter what. And so by removing the people in the CMC that may have been counseling him against doing any rash action, it may increase the likelihood that Taiwan becomes a real issue in the next year or so.
Oh, that's pretty dark.
It is. And the question is, what does the US do about it? If the Chinese make a move on Taiwan, do they defend Taiwan? That's one of the key uncertainties in the region now is are the Americans there to defend Taiwan or aren't they? If they don't defend Taiwan, how does Japan and South Korea and Australia then think about its own security? You've already got South Korea talking about potentially getting their own nuclear weapons. I think Japan might follow suit. We wouldn't get nuclear weapons, but we would be thinking, how do we defend ourselves if the Americans do want to pull back to an offshore balancer role in the Indo-Pacific? Not isolationism in the Western Hemisphere, but they're not necessarily there to stand with us if they're not prepared to defend Taiwan, because Taiwan is at the geostrategic center of that first island chain. If they don't defend Taiwan, what's the point of the first island chain?
That's really true. Malcolm, we have run out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming on the Downlink podcast.
It's my pleasure, as always.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.